My name is Laura. I'm 32 years old and I'm an architect. I decided to move to a house in the suburbs to get away from the stress of the city and concentrate on my new project. The house was perfect. An old building with a lot of character and surrounded by nature. However, from the first week, I began to notice that I was not alone. There was nothing out of the ordinary when I moved in. The first night I felt something strange was a week after moving in. I woke up suddenly with the feeling that something wasn't right. The clock read 3:15 in the morning. I didn't think much of it and went back to sleep. The feeling persisted. I woke up every night, always at the same time. I decided to get up and walk around the house. Everything was in its place. There was no sign of intrusion, but the restlessness did not go away. I began to notice small changes in the house. The basement door, which I always kept closed, was ajar. A book on the shelf was in a different place. At first I thought I was just forgetting things, or maybe I had inadvertently moved something. I woke up again at 3:15. This time I heard a whisper. It was so soft that at first I thought it was the wind. But no, it was a human voice, barely audible. I went downstairs with my heart pounding. No one was there. However, in the kitchen on the table, I found a small object I didn't recognize, an old coat button covered in dust. The situation worsened. I began to feel a presence in my room. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. The air became thick and my skin prickled. One night, I woke up with the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned my head slowly and saw a shadow in the corner of the room. Barely distinguishable, but definitely human. I decided to install security cameras. I reviewed the recordings from the previous nights and, to my surprise, I saw a fuzzy figure entering my room. I couldn't see his face, but he was moving slowly, almost as if floating. What was most disturbing was that he seemed to be watching me as I slept, before disappearing without a trace. I began to receive notes. Little scraps of paper would appear in random places around the house. "You are not alone. I'm watching you. Every night I get closer." The handwriting was shaky, as if someone had written with great effort or fear. I awoke with a sense of utter panic. This time the presence was much closer. I could feel its breath in my ear, a cold, icy whisper that murmured my name. I jumped up and turned on all the lights in the house, but found no one. My friends began to worry. I told them what was happening, but no one believed me. They said it was stress or that I was imagining things. I decided not to bring it up again, but the terror continued to grow every night. The last night in the house. I woke up as usual at 3:15. This time I saw the figure clearly. She was standing at the foot of my bed watching me. It was a woman with old clothes and a pale, almost translucent face. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed with fear. The figure leaned toward me and I could hear her voice clearly. "Why are you in my house?" I woke up the next day with the decision to leave. I packed my things and left the house that evening. I never went back. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I can still feel that presence, that distant whisper that reminds me that there are places where the living are not welcome and that some visitors never leave. I had never been bothered by phone calls until the midnight ones started coming in. The first time it rang, I was sound asleep. I awoke startled, groping for my cell phone in the dark. "Hello?" I answered, my voice still sleepy. No one answered, just the whisper of the wind through the line. I hung up, thinking it was a mistake. The second night was the same, and the third. By the fourth night, my sleep was light and nervous, waiting for the call. I knew it would come. That night, I answered before the first full ring. "Who is it?" I asked, irritated. Again, silence. But this time something was different. A barely audible whisper, a breath. I hung up immediately, my heart pounding. Who would do this? The next few nights didn't get any better. Each time the call came at the same time, and each time the silence felt heavier, more oppressive. I began to notice small changes in my daily life. I felt I was being watched, even though I didn't see anyone. Things in my apartment were not where I had left them. I began to question my sanity. I decided to tell a friend about the calls, but his reaction was skepticism. "It's probably a prankster. Just change your number," he suggested. It seemed logical, but something in me doubted it would work. I opted to stay up that night waiting for the call. The hours passed slowly until the clock struck midnight. The phone rang, and a shiver ran down my spine. I answered without speaking, waiting. This time, a soft, distorted voice whispered my name. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Paranoia enveloped me. I checked every lock, every window. How did they know my name? Why were they calling me? The following nights, the calls continued, increasingly disturbing. The voice began to reveal intimate details, secrets I had shared with no one. "I remember your first love. I know what you did when you thought no one was looking," the voice would say. I began to have nightmares, my days filled with anxiety. Every little coincidence seemed like an omen. One day I came home to find a note on my door. "See you soon." My blood froze. My blood froze. Who could it be? Psychological terror was tearing me apart. I decided to go to the police, but with no evidence or suspects, they treated me like a paranoid. I returned home, defeated and fearful. That night I didn't answer the call. The phone rang and rang until it finally stopped. A week later the call came early. I answered with trembling hands. "I'm here," the voice said. I slowly turned around and saw a shadow move in the gloom of my apartment. The call cut off. Finally I understood. There was no ghost, no supernatural being. It was someone who knew me too well. Someone who had been watching me, gathering information, and was now here in my home. And at that moment the real terror began. I have always loved driving at night. The quiet of the deserted road, the enveloping darkness, the constant murmur of the engine. It was my way of escaping the stress of everyday life. But that night, something forever changed my perception of those nighttime escapades. I had been driving for hours on a lightly traveled back road, enjoying the solitude, when I saw something in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a broken-down car on the shoulder. The hood was up and a man was standing next to it, signaling desperately with a flashlight. I slowed down and stopped a few meters in front of his car. I rolled down the window and asked him if he needed help. The man, in his mid-30s, with a worn jacket and a haggard face, looked at me with a mixture of relief and despair. "Thank God you stopped," he said. "My car broke down and I don't have reception to call a tow truck. Could you give me a ride to the next town?" I nodded, feeling a slight uneasiness in my stomach. Something about the look in his eyes didn't sit right with me, but it was late and I couldn't leave him there alone. He opened the door and sat in the passenger seat. The smell of tobacco and sweat filled the car. We started driving, and the silence became oppressive. I tried to make conversation, but his answers were short and strained. I noticed that he constantly glanced sideways at me, and his fingers drummed nervously on his knee. "Where did you come from?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Nowhere in particular," he replied. "I'm just passing through." Something in his tone made my hair stand on end. My mind began to wander, creating terrifying scenarios. What if he wasn't who he said he was? What if he had sinister intentions? The road continued to wind through the darkness, and the next town seemed light years away. Finally, after what seemed like hours, we spotted lights in the distance. It was a small roadside gas station, the only lighted place for miles. I decided it would be best to stop there and let him find another way to get to his destination. "I'm going to stop here. You can get help," I said, trying to sound casual. "No need," he replied curtly. "Keep driving." My heart began to pound. "I think I'd better pull over. I need to use the bathroom," I lied. Without warning, his hand moved to his jacket and he pulled out a knife, pointing it at me. "Keep driving," he repeated, his voice now steady and icy. Adrenaline flooded my body. My mind was working at full speed, trying to find a way out of that situation. I could see the reflection of the knife glinting under the dim light of the dashboard. "Don't try anything stupid," he said, as if he could read my thoughts. "Just keep driving." Suddenly a truck appeared on the horizon, its blinding lights illuminating the road. Without thinking, I swerved onto the shoulder and slammed on the brakes. The man staggered, and I seized the moment to jump out of the car and run toward the truck, yelling for help. The truck driver, a burly, determined man, jumped out of his cab and ran toward me. The man with the knife, seeing the situation slipping out of his hands, returned to his car and started up, disappearing into the darkness. The truck driver called the police, and while we waited, I sat in the cab of the truck, trembling. When they finally arrived, they took my statement and began the search for the man. I never knew if they found him, but that night taught me a terrifying lesson. In the loneliness of the road, the real threat is not always the supernatural, but the dark intentions of the people who cross our path. It all started when I found that diary in the attic of my grandparents' house. They had recently passed away, and I was given the task of emptying the house before selling it. The attic was full of dusty boxes and forgotten items, but among all that clutter, a small leather notebook caught my eye. The journal was covered in dust and looked very old. I opened it curiously and began to read. The first few pages were full of scribbles and incoherent notes, but soon the tone changed. The author, whose name was never mentioned, described in disturbing detail a series of murders. Each entry recounted a crime with chilling precision: names, dates, places, methods. At first I thought it was a novel or some kind of macabre fiction, but the more I read, the more real it felt. The descriptions were so vivid, so full of cold, calculating emotion that my skin crawled. I stopped reading and looked around. The attic, with its gloom and musty smell, suddenly became oppressive. I stowed the journal in my backpack, determined to review it later at home. I didn't want to spend any more time in that place. That night in my apartment, I couldn't resist the temptation to continue reading. The author of the diary detailed his movements with obsessive precision. The victims seemed to be chosen at random, but each crime was meticulously planned. There was a methodical coldness to the descriptions that made my hair stand on end. As I read on, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Some of the locations described in the diary were familiar. They were places near where I lived, places I had frequented. I felt a chill as I realized that the crimes were not only real, but that they had occurred close to my community. My paranoia grew. I began to feel watched. Every time I left the house, I looked around suspiciously, convinced that someone was following me. The shadows seemed longer, the corners darker. I began to doubt the people I knew, wondering if any of them could be the author of the diary. One night, As I was reading the last diary entry, I heard a noise outside my apartment. It was a faint creaking sound, as if someone was stepping carefully on the floor. I turned off the lights and walked over to the window, trying to see without being seen. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I decided to take the diary to the police, but I hesitated. Would they believe me? Would they think it was a prank, or worse, that I was involved? Paranoia was consuming me. Finally, I made a decision. I would confront the one person who might know more about that diary. I went back to my grandparents' house and searched through old documents and photos. I found a photo of my grandfather with a group of men, all smiling. On the back of the photo, there were names. One of them looked familiar, a man who still lived in the city. With my heart pounding, I went to his house. At first he was kind and surprised to see me. I showed him the newspaper and his expression changed. The color drained from his face and his hands began to shake. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "At my grandparents' house. What is this? Is it real?" I insisted. The man looked at me with despair. "Your grandfather and I, we did terrible things in the past, things we've tried to forget. But I never thought anyone would find this." I recoiled, horrified. The truth was worse than I imagined. The diary was real, the crimes were real, and my grandfather, along with this man, had been responsible for it all. I left his house, the diary clutched to my chest. I knew I had to turn it in to the police, but I also knew that my life would never be the same again. The shadows in which my grandfather lived now loomed over me, and the knowledge of his darkness had become my own burden. I've always been curious and somewhat casual about psychological studies, so when I saw the online ad seeking volunteers for a paid experiment on a university campus, I didn't hesitate to sign up. The idea of contributing to the advancement of science and earning extra money seemed too good to be true. On the day of the experiment, I was greeted in a university building by a serious-looking researcher and a nervous-looking assistant. They explained to me that the study focused on stress responses and how they affected cognitive performance. It all sounded pretty standard and ethical, so I signed the consent forms without much thought. I was ushered into a small room with a table, chair, and computer screen. The researcher explained that I was to complete a series of tasks while my physiological responses were monitored. I eagerly agreed, ready to begin. At first, everything went smoothly. The tasks were simple, such as solving puzzles or memorizing sequences. However, as time progressed, the tasks became more complicated, and the atmosphere in the room seemed to become more oppressive. Each task was designed to induce stress, either because of its complexity or the limited time to complete it. During breaks between tasks, I was left alone in the room. But instead of feeling relief, I felt increasingly anxious and watched. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers or saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned around, no one was there. Over time, the lack of sleep and constant stress began to affect me. My responses to tasks became erratic and my thoughts clouded. The voices of the researcher and his assistant seemed more distant, as if they were speaking from another world. One night, after a long testing session, I was alone in the room waiting for the next instruction. The computer screen suddenly lit up with a message he hadn't expected. "You can't trust them." It flickered for a moment and disappeared. My heartbeat quickened. Was it part of the experiment, or was I losing my mind? I looked around, but the room was quiet and empty as usual. The next day, I decided to confront the researcher. I told him about the message on the screen and how I was feeling increasingly paranoid and suspicious. He assured me that it was impossible for that to happen. that the computer was completely controlled, and that my mental health was a priority for them. However, the seed of doubt was already planted in my mind. Could I really trust them? What else could they be hiding from me? Every step I took in the lab seemed to be watched. Every sound made me jump. Finally, I decided to end the experiment. Although they offered to continue, even increasing the compensation, I declined the offer. I could not stand any longer in that tense and unnerving environment. After I left the lab, it was weeks before I could sleep well again. The memory of those days of stress and paranoia will never completely disappear. Now, when I see advertisements for psychological studies, I feel a shiver run down my spine. I can't help but wonder what dark discoveries the researchers might be looking for in the minds of their volunteers. When I adopted Rex, a seemingly adorable little mixed-breed puppy, I never imagined that my life would turn into a nightmare. At first, everything was normal. He played with enthusiasm, wagged his tail with joy, and was the center of attention at the local dog park. But over time, I began to notice something unsettling in his behavior. He would become aloof and reserved when we were home alone, often staring blankly into an empty corner of the room. His barking at night also became more frequent, as if he was trying to communicate with something only he could see. One night I was startled awake by a shrill noise coming from the living room. I ran downstairs to find Rex standing in front of the pantry door, growling fiercely inward. The door was ajar, and despite my growing fear, I turned on the light and opened it fully. Nothing seemed out of place. I scanned the shelves full of food and supplies without finding anything suspicious. Rex was still growling, his eyes fixed on a spot invisible to me. I began to feel uncomfortable, as if I was invading a space I shouldn't have disturbed. After that night, things got worse. Rex began to have sudden mood swings, from overflowing euphoria to unexplained aggression. At times, he would look at me with dark eyes filled with an intensity that chilled my blood. My friends joked about dogs with personalities, but I knew something wasn't right. One afternoon, while I was home alone, I heard a thud coming from the basement. I cautiously descended the stairs, and what I found made me recoil in horror. Rex was standing at the foot of the stairs, staring into the darkness of the basement with fierce determination. His fur was bristling and his teeth showed in a deep growl. I shivered as I approached the threshold. I looked down and saw a blurry figure in the gloom, something moving slowly upward. Before I could react, Rex lunged forward, barking and clawing frantically at the figure. The struggle was brief but intense. When I turned on the basement light, I saw Rex holding tightly to something I couldn't believe. A stranger in tattered clothes and disheveled appearance, clearly startled by the dog's sudden onslaught. He had sneaked into my house, probably looking for something of value. I called the police and the intruder was arrested. Rex was praised for his bravery, but I couldn't help but feel uneasy about what I had witnessed. How had Rex known there was someone in the basement before I did? What had he seen in it that I hadn't? Although Rex returned to his normal demeanor after that incident, the uneasy feeling never completely disappeared. His occasional glance into empty corners and his nightly barking continued to remind me that sometimes animals can sense things that we humans can't understand. I had heard stories about the old hotel since I was a child. It was said to have been a thriving place in the golden years, but had been suddenly abandoned after a mysterious incident. Curiosity consumed me every time I walked past its imposing, crumbling facade. One afternoon I decided to venture inside. The front door was ajar, creaking with a creepy groan when I pushed it. The interior was covered in dust and cobwebs, with broken furniture and debris strewn across the floor. A marble staircase led up, and without much thought I began to climb. Each step echoed in the ominous silence of the building. As I ascended, the air became thicker and colder, as if I was entering a forgotten and forbidden world. Broken windows let in rays of dim light that illuminated ghostly shadows on the peeling walls. I reached the second floor and found the rooms. The doors were ajar, some hanging off their hinges. I decided to explore one of them. As I pushed open the door, a high-pitched creaking sound made me jump. The interior was dark and dank, with mold-covered furniture and torn curtains swaying in the wind. A sense of oppression began to grip me as I continued to explore. Each room seemed to contain an echo of past events, an echo of broken lives and abandoned dreams. I wondered who the last guests had been, what secrets the stained walls and broken mirrors hid. Reaching the end of the hallway, I found a locked door. Curiosity prompted me to try to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard a dull thud behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Only the echo of my own fear echoed in the empty corridors. I decided to head back towards the exit, but the feeling of being watched intensified with every step. Every shadow seemed to move on its own. Every whisper of the wind became a menacing whisper in my mind. My steps quickened until I was running through the corridors, desperate to find the exit. Finally, I reached the staircase and descended the steps 2 at a time. The creak of the front door sounded like a warning as I rushed into the daylight. I came out panting and walked away from the building, feeling as if I had narrowly escaped something indescribable that inhabited the shadows of the abandoned hotel. Since that day, I have never passed near the hotel again. Nightmares and the feeling of being watched still haunt me in the dark of night. The hotel has become a grim reminder that there are places in this world that should remain sealed forever, holding dark secrets that are not meant to be discovered.